Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are too many, and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that, when there befalleth us any war, they also join themselves unto our enemies, and fight against us, and get them up out of the land. These words from the Torah, or Old Testament, may be the earliest reference of anti-Semitism, of hating Jews. The Pharaoh of Egypt seeing Jews as a fifth column that could join their enemy in a war, and it is a good place for us to begin this discussion. But first allow me to introduce myself and this video. Hi, I'm Benjamin, and given the subject matter of this video, I need to note Jewish history and Judaism is not all tears and fears. The subject matter we are about to go through is intense. So get your popcorn, tap the like button, and consider donating to the channel. But about the 5 ages, they bleed into each other. Motifs that you get in 300, the year 300, can be found today. They repackage, recycle tropes, fuse them together, and then resell them to the ignorant. So let's get into this history because it's long now. Part 1. Ancient Competitors. What we have in the ancient era is not the anti-Semitism we know today. In the ancient world, the Egyptians, the Greeks, Babylonians, Persians, and Romans each spoke of other nations and peoples around them with insults, ugly imagery, otherworldliness. Xenophobia is the wrong word because of the left-wing ideas it carries today. This was an ethnic fight between early civilizations, between competitors and rivals, in a world where the ends of the earth and the beginning of make-believe were never far away. But it is fitting that record of anti-Semitism begins with the Egyptians in the early 3rd century BCE, 150 years before Cleopatra, but of the same Greek-speaking dynasty. Here, the story of the Jewish exodus from Egypt into Israel has been translated into Greek in the Septuagint, or the Greek Old Testament. Would it make you angry if you were an Egyptian and the biblical story said the God of these Jews had wrecked your kingdom, humiliated you, and then allowed them to escape with your gold after killing all of your firstborn sons? It might make you a bit angry, right? Well, it appears that an Egyptian priest of the time named Manetho was a bit angry. This was during the Greek Hellenistic period. Let me know if you want a video on Hellenism, by the way. But this Egyptian priest, Manetho, wrote a history of Egypt in Greek. In his history, Aegyptiaca, he takes the Jewish Exodus story and flips it upside down, saying that the Egyptians cast out the Jews for their leprosy and filthy diseases, whilst the Jews suffered centuries before this under the Neo-Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II. The Babylonians did not really have any special hatred for Jews. Yes, the first temple of Solomon was destroyed, but this kind of thing was a common thing to do. The hatred was ethnic, between competing powers of the age. It was the done thing. But after Alexander the Great's empire, during the Hellenistic era, hatred of Jews began to slowly reshape itself through a Greek cultural lens of Greek polytheism versus Jewish monotheism. A series of Greco-Egyptian and Greek writers from this point begin attacking Jews along religious grounds in many cases. Kuremon of Alexandria ridicules the Exodus and the Jews as unclean lepers, following on from Manetho. Posidonius, who helped spread the ass tale a lie that Jews in their temple worship a statue of a donkey's head, as well as kidnapping Greeks. He calls Jews evil and gives a foundation to the tales of Apion, an Egyptian Greek writer in the 1st century, who is quoted by Josephus, a Roman Jewish historian, who defends Judaism against him. But these accusations and others are of a Greek empire annoyed by a people who will not adopt their Greek religion. It is little different to when Rome invaded Britain, making fantastical stories about Druids, and then attacking Ynys Môn, here in Wales, the holy island of the Celtic Druids. Or rather, it was very much like it, until King Antiochus IV, king of the Greek Seleucid Empire, passed edicts in 167 BCE that outlawed Jewish religious practices such as circumcision. You cannot forbid Jews to circumcise. That is a bedrock of Judaism. It was essentially banning Judaism. A Jewish revolt broke out under the Maccabees. This was new. It was a religious war, not between polytheism and polytheism of different religions, but between polytheism and monotheism. Jews won their independence and liberated Jerusalem. Having a war not between two religions, but between two kinds of religion, was new, and the growing power of Rome to the west was not blind to this. 3 times, within 200 years, up to the year 50, Jews were expelled from Rome. The Senator Cicero says they are a race born to be slaves, and as you can see, this is still an ethnic component, but this is shifting as Greek culture begins to change the Roman culture. The first true and recorded pogrom against Jews takes place in Roman Alexandria in Egypt in the year 38, because monotheistic Jews will not venerate the emperor as if he is a god. When Rome conquered Judea, the general Pompey entered the temple's Holy of Holies, an intentional insult of a religious nature. This was more than ethnic. It was a religious conquest, and whilst the Jewish-Roman wars are beyond the scope of this video, I need to mention how angry Romans were that this small province kept revolting, though the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 was not much different in some ways to Rome destroying other conquered peoples' holy temples. What set this apart was the sheer effort Rome went to in order to spread propaganda about this temple's destruction and to keep the Jews suppressed. By making this conquest such a public declaration beyond mere triumph, Rome began to view Jews in a different way than it had before, and attacked the Jewish religion rather than ethnic views of prior ages. Emperor Hadrian attempted to ban circumcision, which caused a 4-year-long revolt across present-day Israel, and coins to be minted bearing the words, "To the freedom of Jerusalem," and "Freedom from Zion." Keep that word Zion in mind for later. The Roman Empire issued a Jewish tax at this time, after the destruction of the temple, with converts to Judaism forced to pay for the building of temples to Roman gods, and old men humiliated by being checked for circumcision. That's kind of gross. This was beyond ethnic hatred now. This was a religious persecution rooted in ethnic hatred. There was a shift here, moving from ethnic into religion. In 136, Emperor Hadrian, to cut the Jewish people off from their land, renamed Judea as Syria Palestina, or for short, Palestina. That would shape the future, wouldn't it? According to historian Edward Gibbon, from the year 160 there is a greater tolerance toward Jews. Maybe, maybe not. But by this time, a new religion had been born, in the land of Israel itself, and anti-Semitism was about to change forever. Part 2. Christian Anti-Semitism. 7 years after Edward Gibbon's date of 160, a new kind of anti-Semitism is first recorded in present-day Turkey along the Adriatic Sea, when a bishop, Melito of Sardis, gives a sermon about Passover, Peripascha. Basically, it goes like this. Melito said Jesus was killed during Passover, when in truth, if Jesus was crucified even, it would have been done the day before, but the damage was done, and this sermon reflects how many early Christians saw Judaism as a betrayal of God that ought to be destroyed, dissolved, or assimilated. But look at it like this. Christianity was the new kid. How annoying was it for its own scriptures to be built on top of an older religion, which spoke to it like a parent, and refutes the astrology and ideas of your religion. This resentment became clear, and early Christianity could not assert itself without pushing Judaism down. The 4th century was particularly revolutionary, as Christianity consolidated itself and its beliefs as being in opposition to Jewish ideas. In 313, Christian persecution ends, and its spread accelerates throughout the empire. Jews were banned from marrying Christians, though I doubt many did. Still, I guess you should be able to under a state, right? Anyway, then Jews and Christians were banned from celebrating Passover together. There were a whole series of laws and edicts passed against Jews. It became a bit obsessive, actually. Conversion to Judaism was outlawed. I guess I wouldn't last long in that place. In 380, Judaism itself narrowly avoided being outlawed, as Christianity became the official religion of the empire. Synagogues were destroyed from Rome to Iraq, as the idea of deicide, that Jews killed Jesus, spread across the Mediterranean and into the Levant. Petros Chrysologos, in the early 5th century, later canonized as a saint, gave a sermon in which he said, "Envy made the Jews deicides." Is it any wonder then that during his own lifetime in his native northern Italy, that synagogues were destroyed? He wasn't exactly friends to the Jews. Saint Jerome is noted as saying that the prayers of Jews turn into sins which spread into Christian souls and drag them down into hell. He says they conspired against him. Abraham the Syrian, another saint, repeatedly said that Satan dwells among the Jews. And so you can see what is going on here. Christianity in its youth is defining itself as having been persecuted by Jews so that it can persecute Judaism to establish its legitimacy as being above it and closer to the truth. Further east, Christianity's growth forced Persia to restore its Zoroastrian faith as the state religion. In the 5th century, though it tolerated Christianity in places, however elsewhere, to maintain their authority, it came down hard on other religions, including Judaism, and Jews across Persia were massacred in the 5th century and 6th. This type of anti-Semitism was explicitly religious in nature, not ethnic. It even forced the Jews of Babylon to revolt, forming a Jewish state for 7 years in Iraq. Not bad, an independent Jewish kingdom for 7 years. They tried. But I digress. The point of me mentioning Persia is to show that what was about to come out of the Arabian Peninsula in reference to Jews was part of the spreading religion-based anti-Semitism that was international in scope and in the spirit of the age. At this point, going into the 7th century, Islam erupts out of the Arabian Peninsula. And if you want me to go into a video specifically about anti-Semitism in Islam, let me know, but I do not have the time to go into it in this video. Just to mark in short that the expansion of Islam begins with the beheading of Jewish men, the enslavement of their children, and the condemning of their women to an unimaginably horrific fate. Here in Britain, where I am, in the 8th century, the works of Bede in his hatred of the Welsh bear semblance to criticisms of Jews. Bede takes insults typically reserved for Jews, such as hatred of the truth, love of falsehood, and twists them into anti-Britishness, inspired by anti-Semitism. In this sense, Jews had become a common trope across Christendom to insinuate deviation from truth especially, but also immorality, depravity, and conspiracy. Though this ebbed and softened a bit under the Carolingian Emperor Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, where Jews saw some tolerance and promotion into official positions, this was not to last. This was the era of the Carolingian Renaissance, with its economic height being from 775 to 830, and a moment of learning and stability in which Jews did flourish for a time. But the Christian Church erected anti-Jewish propaganda in statues outside their churches and in other places, from windows to manuscripts, called Ecclesia et Synagoga. Less than 2 decades after Charlemagne, and relevant to anti-Semitism across the ages, the Carolingian Empire's economy took a turn for the worse, around 830 during a civil war, when people looked back toward the Christian Church and also sought a scapegoat to blame their problems on. And so it is no coincidence that the first known Ecclesia et Synagoga is found sometime between 830 and 850 in a Carolingian manuscript. It is difficult to see here, but I need to point this out. A Jew here is depicted as an old man, begging toward Jesus. His health is sapped. He is feeble, weak, old, and all the Christians in this image are in a higher position to him. This motif is found hundreds of times over the next 3 or 4 centuries with pairs of statues. The Jewish of the pair seen as being blindfolded to the truth, unable to hold on to even the 10 Commandments as it slips from hand, and the staffs are broken to show the loss of power. Contrast this with the radiant strength of the Christian statues, and the intent of the propaganda is clear. Sometimes Jews are holding rams or donkeys, a symbol of sacrificial superstitions, harking back to the Roman times, and even the killing of Jesus. Christianity was asserting itself. In Metz, present-day northeast France, and part of this Carolingian Empire, Jews and Christians were forbidden from eating together on account of the sins of the Jews, whilst in Byzantium Jews were forced to convert to Christianity by force. Many killed, with those that remained forbidden from holding any civil or military positions. Simultaneously, in the Muslim world, Jews were forced to wear a yellow belt. The Christian world also adopted marking out Jews by clothing several times in the coming centuries, often for centuries at a time. The reason I note the separation of Jews and Christians in Metz, which happened across Europe at flashpoints, usually followed by mobs burning synagogues, and the forced conversion in Byzantium, which was one of several, and the forcing of Jews to wear yellow belts, is that following the Carolingian Renaissance, anti-Semitism increased and increased and increased until massacres were had in the Crusades in the Rhineland. But for now it grew slowly in relation to the Christian Church administrative structure and in the Muslim world, according to the prosperity or decline of the Islamic caliphates. Across the Christian world, the sins of Jews were seen as a contagious sin, and the insult of killing Jesus seen as proof of their treachery. The Christian anti-Semitism of medieval times focused on separation to allow Christianity to both define itself and its own values without its own Jewish roots, and to raise the Christian religion's power structure above a convenient scapegoat that allowed the Church to concentrate power. However, the mood of anti-Semitism began to slowly change after the Great Schism of 1054, in which the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church went their own ways. What this did is it forced Christendom to solidify its own identity. Up to this point, the Christian Church's relation to Jews was that of a young, forming institution, resentful of its Jewish parent. But now its Christian philosophy was forced, against other Christians, to have firm roots. This meant the Christian relation to Jews began to change, and slowly Jews were othered into the realms of absurd fantasy. The transition from Christian anti-Semitism to medieval fantasies is the most gradual and overlapping of these 5 ages. As I said prior, one age of anti-Semitism does not mean the traits of the former are gone. The age of separation, raising Christian above Jewish, parting the two into pure and unclean, was a root that fed into the insane fantasies to come. From theology to fantasy. In the year 1144, the first Cistercian monks settled in Wales, whose religious order would become a backbone of Welsh political resistance to the English at the exact moment when the English were engulfed in a civil war called the Anarchy. In Paris, the Basilica of Saint-Denis was completed, the first Gothic church. In modern-day Turkey, the Christian county Edessa, a Crusader kingdom, fell to the Islamic Turkoman Seljuk Empire, and in England, a 12-year-old tanner's apprentice was violently murdered in Norwich, with the killer remaining unknown. These 5 events may seem unrelated, but they are related, and a new kind of anti-Semitism was about to rear its head, out of where these 5 things converged in Christian political power and distrust of others. This new kind of anti-Semitism was fantastical, absurd, and expressed itself first in the blood libel. Young William of Norwich was violently murdered in 1144, and the Jewish community was blamed. But without evidence, nothing was done for now. Far away, that Edessa had fallen to the Muslims sparked the wealthy kingdom of France that was building Gothic cathedrals to invest in building an army of Christian crusaders united under the Pope to defeat Islam. Lisbon in Portugal was liberated from Muslim rule. But in the east, the various Christian nations bickered and fell out with each other, causing the crusade to be a disaster. Church orders split further into rival groups suspecting each other, one of them being the Cistercians, used by the Welsh princes to fight the English. In England, however, some of these crusaders came home to Norwich, and amongst those suspected of betraying the Christian crusade were the Jews. Why are they always blaming the Jews? The case of young William was brought back 6 years after his death, in 1150, and the Jews of Norwich were accused of torturing William in an elaborate Jewish holy ritual, mocking the murder of Jesus. It did not help that these Jews were French-speaking and associated with the Norman financial trade due to restrictions on their employment across Europe. In this case, the Norman French authorities stepped in and stopped Jews from being killed. Thankfully, but this was all happening in the middle of an English civil war. The story of William's murder spread through England to Gloucester in 1168, where another boy, Harold, was murdered. Local Jews were blamed for a circumcision ceremony and a mysterious blood ritual. Another English boy, Robert, in Suffolk, who died in 1181, has the claim Jews were trying to crucify him and use his blood. This accusation came to be known as blood libel. It is utterly ridiculous, And this insane fantasy, for some reason, spread across all of Europe. It makes no sense as to why it spread across so many countries. From the east of England all the way to the Ural Mountains of Russia, eventually. Dead children were associated with Jewish blood rituals that have no basis in reality. I mean, if you know anything about Judaism, Jews go out of their way to avoid blood due to kosher rules, dietary rules, and other things. And as you would expect, mobs in these places began murdering Jews in the most horrific ways. This led in part to the massacre at York in 1190, in which 150 Jews died in a tower, many choosing suicide rather than renouncing their faith. Sadly, this type of massacre was not uncommon across Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. Another mad fantasy that arose after this point did not even need human victims for people to hunt down Jews and blame them for evil. They were accused of what is called host desecration. And I need to explain what this means first. The word desecration literally means to remove what is sacred in something, to de-sacredize, yeah? The host is the wafer or the bread and wine that Christians, mainly Catholics and Anglicans now, eat in a ceremony in which the bread and wine literally becomes the blood or the presence of Jesus. And messing with these holy wafer and wines is an ultimate sacrilege. Anyway, you need to know what the accusation is. The accusation was, as you can see in the picture here, is that Jews tampered with, or often stole the wafer, in order to torture them in rituals mocking Jesus. Yes, torturing bread. You can see in this image, these people thought Jews stabbed the bread in order to... This is so ridiculous, I'm having trouble even saying it. You can see in this image, these people thought Jews stabbed the bread in order to draw out the blood of Jesus. It is completely insane that people believed this stuff. And here you have... just nuts. And here you have Jews paying a Christian traitor to steal the wafers or the Eucharist, with the Jews being found out and burned alive. This is another thing. Jews were being burned alive a lot during this time, from the 12th to 15th centuries, in Western and Central Europe. The irony of all this is that if you have even a basic understanding of Jewish law, what Judaism is, this is about the last thing any practicing Jew could even think to do. It's against everything Jewish I can think of, which makes it even more absurd. But anti-Semitism is absurd, and in this age, it reflected that the Christian ethos was veering off into fantasy. In 1475, one of the most noteworthy cases was seen in Simon of Trent, in northern Italy. Again, a boy was found murdered. The city of Trento's Jews were accused of murdering a boy based on exsanguination. That means drawing out the blood. 15 Jews were burned alive, with another killed the following year. Naturally, from the 13th to the 15th century, became social fevers and frenzies backed by evil mobs with masks and flags. Never ever trust a mob with masks on. And since the rulers of Western European states could not often pay back the Jews, who were forced to lend money as a profession due to economic restrictions put on them by those states, what we see is a series of expellings. For instance, King Edward, who had conquered Wales, found expelling Jews from his kingdom useful. He had racked up a lot of debt conquering Wales, and kicking the Jews out meant he could avoid paying back loans and politically appease the mobs who were killing Jews across his kingdom. The ideas of Christian separation and fantasy libels had fused, and Jews were expelled from England, Spain, Portugal, France, various German-speaking lands, papal states, in some places more than once. It just goes on and on. In Germany, the Judensau appeared in the 13th century, picturing Jews in filthy contact with a large pig, often linked with Satan. This was a way for the utterly ignorant to explain the Jewish ban on eating pork. These images spread across Germany and into Sweden and carved into churches and entrances to Jewish ghettos. The pig in Judaism is considered unclean, so this is really insulting. Then the Black Death hit, and can you guess who was blamed? With the spread of the Black Death, Jews were accused of poisoning wells, forced under torture to admit they did so, and then burned alive. In that, I have not even begun to talk about the medieval massacres here, and it was bad. But what we're focusing on is that this hatred of Jews shifted out of Christian doctrine into bizarre, fictional fantasies that made no sense. And it was changing. The Protestant Reformation of Martin Luther twisted this further. He even published a 65,000-word rant in 1543 called On the Jews and Their Lies, where he basically asks people to burn down synagogues, forbid rabbis, and remove all Jewish writings, whilst comparing Jews to worms and witches. Have you ever wondered why witches have long noses, green skin, and pointy hats? A lot of it is Martin Luther's influence and his attacks on Jews, using the tropes of the ages before him in a new way. Keep in mind, many Jews were forced to wear pointy, cone-shaped hats by law so they could be identified. Martin Luther's anti-Judaism would become essential reading for children living in Nazi Germany. Christians faced a problem at this point, however, in history. The Protestant Reformation was slowly giving way to liberalism by the mid-17th century, which meant more freedom for all, and things did improve for Jews slowly across the 17th and 18th centuries. But do not think this meant that Jews had it easy. In Switzerland, for example, Jews were legally restricted to just 2 towns on the eve of America's independence. The Pope in Italy personally had Jewish children stolen from their parents. In the Caribbean and in Austria-Hungary, Jews were forced to pay special taxes for their new freedoms. France emancipated its Jews, and other European nations would follow, yet the past is always part of now. The otherness of medieval fantasy had not gone away, but a shift was happening, again in anti-Semitism. Non-Jews of the Enlightenment era now faced what came to be called the Jewish question. The reaction against medieval fantasy in the Enlightenment was about to produce a new kind of Jew hatred. Science and race. The Jewish question was first used in Britain in 1753, when a bill was debated in Parliament allowing Jews to be naturalized as British subjects, which led to outbursts of Jew hatred across London. France's Jewish question was largely answered in 1789, La Question Juive. Jews were free, but they had to give up their religious identity in public, which can in Jewish law go against Judaism. In 1843, Germany had Die Judefrage by Bruno Bauer. Jews could be free if they gave up their religious consciousness, which is to say, you can be half Jewish. Karl Marx pushed back against Bauer, stating that Judaism and religion in its entirety must be abolished. But for anyone who understands Judaism, this presents a serious problem. Whilst yes, you can convert to Judaism, as is my own personal journey, for the most part Judaism is passed on by blood along the mother's line, and Jewish boys are circumcised when they are 8 days old. You cannot abolish Judaism without abolishing the Jewish people and culture, which of course is what Karl Marx meant. No, it does not escape me that he was Jewish, and that's a whole nother video. Out of this post-medieval liberal reaction against religion, an urge to be inclusive, to have to accept everyone, the answer to the Jewish question in the 19th century slowly became racial in nature. This was the birth of an anti-God religion in science, the ideas of reason, then communist socialism, and later, National Socialism. What space could there be for the other if we are to make everyone the same? But for the moment, science was galloping its speed into racial traits. From 1853 to 1855, a Frenchman named Arthur de Gobineau published Essai sur l'inégalité des races humaines, an essay on the inequality of the human races. The subject had grown since the 1770s, but Gobineau was the first to both build upon what others had written and to write explicitly about Jews. It might surprise you he had good things to say about Jewish people. His contribution to anti-Semitism is not so much his own hatred, but rather his method of measurement for human races, and his belief that race mixing leads to social downfall. This would become part of Nazi ideas later. For now, Russia was still in the grip of medieval blood libels. How can Russia be so backwards? And saw a whole series of pogroms that helped create a flood of Jewish refugees to the Jewish homeland. For now, in Europe, the old trades of finance that Jews had been restricted to in medieval times were being seen as racial stereotypes of a parasitic capitalistic race, greed, conspiratorial motives. The growth of Karl Marx's ideas played no small part in this. Many of Judaism's worst enemies are Jews. This was an age of liberalism, and those against it, be they Marxist reactionaries or restoration conservatives, were able to blame Jews for the capitalistic success of the emerging and liberal middle class, drawing upon the tropes of medieval Europe to create images that are frankly grotesque. Spiders, gremlins, mushrooms, it's horrific. As the golden age of Europe rolled on, bad elements within the underclass were able to seed images of Jews as being a symbol of decadence they could project onto their rulers to promote revolution. It did not matter if it made any sense whatsoever. People needed someone to blame for them being losers surrounded by wealth. Much of this anti-Semitism came in writing from Russia. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was published in 1903, which tells of an international Jewish conspiracy to rule the world through economic war, landlordism, materialism, control of the press, organized anarchy to control people, and utter insanities, such as believing that Jews, a nation of fewer people than the Netherlands, control every major institution. The same year, 49 Jews were murdered in the Russian city of Kishinev. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion spread into other languages around the globe. Why, you might ask? Liberalism is an ideology, just like socialism, fascism, communism, protectionism, anarchism, and so on. And in liberalism, the losers are those least willing to compromise by giving up their cultural identity. Those who were losing as liberalism began to win found in this book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, an explanation that did not require them to take responsibility nor to blame their own people for failure. This worldwide conspiracy, tapping into medieval tropes, was also rooted in racial discrimination of Europe's Jews. I would be shocked if Hitler had not at some point known whole paragraphs of this book by heart. From this point in 1903, the global conspiracy theories go mental. At its core, it is a scientific way of seeing the world and trying to categorize everything into clean formulas in a world that is not clean. During the First World War, a German named Arthur Dintor wrote Die Sünde wider das Blut. In this book, written in 1917, Dintor expands on a contagion theory that says intercourse with a Jew will damage the genetic makeup of a non-Jewish woman, passing these damaged genes down through their descendants. This book was a bestseller and influenced a young political activist named Adolf Hitler. It needs to be noted that the Soviet Union was communist and saw religion as a drug of capitalist evil, so synagogues were closed down, and rabbis forced to resign or arrested, and Jewish activists had bad things happen. In Germany, Nazis built upon centuries of anti-Jewish tropes, mixing them with each other. They expanded upon the ideas of Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation, especially, and the ideas of usury, lending money at unreasonably high levels. More Jewish stereotypes, which struck a chord with Germans when the currency crashed, making their money useless. Nazis brought back medieval ideas of forcing Jews to wear badges to identify themselves publicly. They also reinstituted the ideas of Jewish separation, but replaced Christian ideas with German paganism. A lot of Hitler's ideas was that he wanted to free the world of an Abrahamic conscience, and he was taking Christian ideas in relation to Judaism and inverting them. It's mental. The Nazis went further and created blood castes, a hierarchy of blood, and a long series of anti-Jewish laws in public life. This was not all at once, and the low point of the Holocaust, with the loss of 6.5 million Jews, happened from 1941 after all of this, ending in the destruction of Europe in 1945. Out of the rubble of war arose an anti-nationalist order, designed in part to help the Jewish people, but it was about to be used over the next century, and the one we are in, to harm the Jewish people. Anti-Zionism. (1945) and its aftermath has forced our current era to be ruled by a liberal cultural status quo, which sees nationalism itself as evil. But at the same time, the Arab world was forced into the mold of the nation-state, where nations had not existed. 3 years after the Holocaust, after nearly 2,000 years, Israel re-established its independence in the Jewish homeland and threw off the colonialist Roman name of Palestine in 1948. This video is already long, and this fifth age of Jew hatred is only now really beginning in our day. It's young still, but in short, this video is not about Arab anti-Semitism rooted in radical Islam, but Western anti-Semitism. And what happened in the West was this. The children born after 1945 were raised in the shadow of a horrific war. In the trauma of their parents' generation, their native Christian faith was gradually removed from public space, public education, and even in laws, and replaced with a Christian doctrine of human rights, made sacred by the United Nations. They also replaced the Christian Satan figure of the hooved pig-loving Jews with a white nationalist demon called Hitler, which slowly, in the liberal mind of the international order, came to represent European males. At the same time, from the 1950s to the 1990s, Jews were portrayed within cultural and academic mediums as being part of whiteness due to their European context in the Holocaust, and how they were portrayed in films. Yes, I am ethnically white as a convert to Judaism, but the majority of Jews are not ethnically European. During this period, cultural leftists infiltrated the higher education systems of America especially, but France too, and then Britain, and parts of Germany. Originally, with Israel being outnumbered and formerly oppressed by the Nazis, great figures of the civil rights movements like Martin Luther King were fiercely pro-Israel. But in the Soviet Union things began to change. With Western states allied to Israel, the communist bloc switched its support from Israel to the Arab nations, and began using the ideas of anti-nationalism, casting America as a racist imperialism, and drawing upon methods to destabilize America from within, not in terms of the current lifetime, but over many decades to come. At first, this did not really move Western ideas around Jews much. Fighting the Nazis had traumatized us and made us more sensitive to hatred of Jews. However, from 1964, a terrorist group called the Palestine Liberation Organization was founded, seeking the destruction of Israel and the death of Jews worldwide in many of its writings. When Soviets began helping this group, it quickly aligned with the left politically. But from 1967, after the Six-Day War in which Israel defeated 5 Arab nations at once, Western leftists began to listen to Soviet ideas about anti-Zionism being fed to them through Palestinian terror organizations and channeled through academic institutions in anti-war demonstrations to create propaganda. Howard Sachar described the allegations of global Jewish conspiracy brought back during the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign in the wake of the Six-Day War. In late July 1967, Moscow launched an unprecedented propaganda campaign against Zionism as a world threat. Defeat was attributed not to tiny Israel alone, but to an all-powerful international force. In its flagrant vulgarity, the new propaganda assault soon achieved Nazi-era characteristics. In the West, academic departments, especially the humanities, from the late 1960s to the early 1990s, were slowly taken over, one after the other, by left-wing ideologues, pushing ideas of social justice, which had been infiltrated ideologically with Soviet destabilization techniques. Many of these new academics, and their protégés rising into corporate boards from the 1990s, openly opposed Israel's right to exist. The ideas of being against nation-states that arose after World War II were being used to direct hearts against Israel, specifically through anti-Zionism, basically anti-nationalism repackaged for anti-Semitism. Growing up in the 1990s, this was not really noticeable to me. I was just a kid, but looking back, the globalization, the opening up of borders in every direction, the erosion of any semblance of national identity, of native languages, of religious belonging, the floods of immigrants from the Third World destroying whole communities, with jobs shipped overseas, deindustrialization, and wages undercut for cheap labor, as our humanities courses in our Western civilization became enclaves of civil rights Marxism and postmodern ideas whose sole aim was to deconstruct objective truth and to destroy the West. It is obvious to me now. We have suffered a cultural revolution in the West that is anti-nationalist at its core. And is there any specific religion you can think of that is rooted almost entirely in the existence of a nation? Yes, Judaism. Zionism is inseparable from Judaism. Today's anti-Semitism is a growth out of liberal anti-nationalism that at its heart seeks to erode the existence of the nation-state. The United Nations each year condemns Israel, a nation the size of Wales, dozens of times more than any nation on earth, which is utterly ridiculous. Israel is a democracy. Why are nations that reduce their whole population to slavery not condemned, like North Korea? The new Satan that replaced Christianity's Satan being the Nazis, is used over and over again to describe Israel with imagery from medieval Christian anti-Semitism. What could possibly be more anti-Semitic than calling Jews Nazis? Since the 7th of October, this has reached new heights of absurdity, with an explosion of anti-Semitism filling our streets. As always, in every age of anti-Semitism, it comes with a mob calling for justice. It comes with people wearing masks and flags. The old images are recycled. The blood libel has come back in the false claim of genocide. Here in Wales, joining with Jews, I have had a mad woman screaming baby killer at me, as if this was 12th century England, rather than 21st century Wales. One thing that strikes me here is that as of making this video, the anti-Zionist mobs have been marching through our streets and vandalizing buildings for almost a year and a half, calling for the death of Jews, using tropes from every age of Jew hatred as our politicians do nothing because they are pro-globalisation, anti-nationalists. The chant "from the river to the sea" means, from the river to the sea, where 7.5 million Jews live. They're not just going to be nice to those Jews, are they? These chants, these mobs are calling for the mass murder of Jews. I never thought I would see anything like this in my lifetime. I could go on about how this Palestinian flag is now little more than a hate Jews symbol, but, why aren't those protesting Israel concerned about the death of hundreds of thousands of Christians in Africa at the hands of Muslims? The reason is anti-nationalism, built out of a moral framework that sees any white collective identity as being literal Nazis, and Jews as belonging to the new white Satan. Jews are also a convenient scapegoat to project their liberal anti-nationalism onto. Zionism for Jews is etched into the DNA of the Jewish faith. We believe that Mount Sinai was, in a sense, the signing of a legal contract with God in exchange for the land of Israel, and that the whole Torah, or Old Testament, is in a sense a deed title to the land of Israel. And yes, I know that some of you in the comments will go on about religion being stupid or something, but my reaction to you is you were just part of this post-war idea that liberal self-expression and self-liberation is the only thing that matters, when my opinion is that faith, ethnicity, and culture matter enough to fight for. That divide between liberal selfishness without borders or nations, and those who want things like faith and culture to exist, that is the tension creating Western anti-Zionism. Because it's never Jews they hate, it's something within themselves and their own conscience that is projected onto Jews. Anti-Zionism is anti-nationalism aimed at Jews. As for where anti-Zionism is going, I don't know. Each age of anti-Semitism mutates and changes, and gets worse before it gets better. So stay safe. But what I do know is, for me at a personal level, following Judaism, the ever-shifting nature of Jew hatred proves to me, without a doubt, that Judaism is right. There is no original sin. You don't need to worry about going to hell. Thank you for watching. Thank you for my Patreons on the screen.